Welcome back, everybody. A few more people popping in. Bear with us now. Just let a few more people in.
Yes.
And if everyone can pop themselves on mute, that would be great as they enter. I'll just put a little note about that in the chat, actually. Okay, welcome, Noel. If you'd like to get started.
Kia ora te tau. I'm Noel Josephson, born and living in Tamaki, Makarao, with my partner and our 3 adult children living nearby. I am a co-founder and chair of Ceres Organics, and I've been involved working full-time in organics for the last 36 years. And it's from my journey towards organics, actually more particularly towards biodynamics, and then my experience in the industry and wanting to know more that, is where this talk comes from today. So, because I'm particularly interested in where things start and how it comes about. And that also gives a pathway to the future. So I used as the introduction Jacinda Ardern's statement that climate change is this generation's nuclear-free moment, not out of any political motive or anything like that, just that her statement quite neatly captures the focus on that's given to climate change. And it's a really good thing that there is a focus on climate change, but climate change doesn't address loss of biodiversity or degradation of the elements. It's only one aspect. And I guess my concern is we're not really asking the same question, the right question, the central question. And also when we focus on this one issue, we're focusing on one metric, on carbon and carbon offsets and carbon reduction. And this to me is a bit simplistic, and also in some cases quite wrong. So if you continue your activity, no matter what it is that's carbon generating, and offsetting your carbon emissions by through carbon credits into a pine plantation, you're only multiplying the problems, not lessening the problems. So a pine plantation is a monoculture that is absolutely destroying the biodiversity in the soil. And it's such a destructive activity on an ecosystem, as is any monoculture. So being carbon neutral or carbon positive in itself may not be the right measure. It's actually what's the activity behind it. And so this is, I want to dig a bit deeper into this and start with the prime drivers of human activity in the world today and their science and economics. And if we look at our economics, economics 101, we very quickly learn that human beings and the environment are only factors in an economic equation. They're not something in themselves. The prime focus is the economics, and the environment as it enters economics is only a cost aspect or a legal requirement. So you can say outside of the cost of extraction and a legal requirement, there is no cost to taking from the environment or dumping back into the environment. It doesn't enter our economics. That is, we can cut down a forest and realize it's the commercial gain from timber without any consideration of the ecosystem, or more directly, perhaps, is we drain a swamp to turn the land into productive land, and we think that's a huge gain without a consideration of what the what it's done to the local ecosystem. And so in this sense, our economics is quite primitive in a way, or not encompassing. It's only focusing on some aspects. We have carbon credits now, and I see that as a positive step, because that is an entry point for the environment into the economic equation. It's a step forward in that sense. It's just that we don't have a differentiation on the quality of different carbon credits. And so then that's the behind that is actually the science we live with, a physical science. And it's a science that works very deeply into each part, each aspect of things. It's not a science of the whole. It's not a science that is able to consider everything in an encompassing view, but it's a science that's able to go deeply into one aspect. It's a technological science, and absolutely the right science for technology, but it's not the right science for life or anything living. And you can see it in statements that are made about anything living. So for instance, you come across statements saying something like, scientific experiments have shown that people that eat a high percentage of highly processed food have an increased risk of dementia. That's a very common scientific statement. It's actually not one that's definite. It's actually quite tentative, that it's an increased risk. And you can see the difference if you take out something living and put in something physical. So if I said to you, scientific experiments have shown that heating water over 100 degrees centigrade brings an increased risk of it boiling. Well, that's nonsense, because it's absolute. Absolutely will boil if you heat it over 100 degrees centigrade. So it's a science that can accurately describe something physical. It's a science that can't describe something living. It can only probe the surface. So another way of looking at it would be, science can tell you that you're made up of 99% of you is made up of 6 elements of hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. And 2 of those elements combined together, hydrogen and oxygen, to mean that you're actually 60% or so made up of water. But science can tell you that fact, but it can't tell you how a living column of water can move about, can talk, can think, can consume food. So science can tell you surface facts, but it actually cannot penetrate life, or rather the science we have, because this science has an evolution too. And this science and economics leads to the metric of human progress that we have today. We measure our progress as gross domestic product. And we could say that's wonderful. Over the last few hundred years, we're all living or most on the whole across the world, we're living in a better material state, and we have longer lifespans on average. But it says nothing about our social well-being, our psychological well-being, and our spiritual well-being. And on those three metrics, which we don't measure in human progress in today's world, actually the world has gone backwards. So that we have a technological science, not a living science, and it's not able to address biodiversity or degradation of the elements. So the real question, or one of the two real questions we face today, is what is our relationship to the earth? Because what's actually happening is we're overwhelming the earth. This science we have of the part, science is not a science of the whole, and yet when we look at the earth, we don't actually see nature. We don't actually see what's happening there because we're not attuned to it. Our science, our upbringing is not attuning us to what's happening in the earth. And the earth itself is actually a whole living organism. And it has the ability to regenerate itself, to bring, to come back into a whole. And if we leave it long enough, and if we haven't absolutely destroyed it turned a forest area into a desert, if we haven't absolutely destroyed it, if we leave a piece of land in New Zealand, most likely after 100 years or so, it will have reverted to native forest, to a mixed native forest. It will, in that process of depending on what's around the edge, of course, but within that forest, it will have got rid of all the species of plants that we call pests, like gorse. The native forest will have overridden the gorse, and it's depending on what's round, it may have actually also balanced itself out in relation to animal life that's taken place. So nature has this inherent ability to regenerate, and it's something we don't recognize, right down to our gardens at home, where we're concerned about the weeds that appear, without recognizing actually these weeds are the first stage of that regeneration process. And of course, an organic farmer, and particularly a biodynamic farmer, it all depends where you are on your journey, because everybody starts at a point of not knowing something, but somewhere on the journey into organics and into biodynamics, you actually discover that weed holds in itself what the soil is lacking. And so a good organic farmer and a biodynamic farmer will compost that weed in some form back into the soil, perhaps directly as compost, perhaps as a tea. And likewise, when we see an insect eating a plant, we think we look at it as a pest, but we actually don't think from the plant's point of view. Have we just had a growth spurt from moisture and warmth, and the plants become bloated, and that insect actually might be relieving the bloating of the plant? we've got to learn to look at nature in a different way, and see what's happening there, because we've got this. The Earth has this biocapacity to renew itself. It can absorb our activity on Earth, and through the natural world regenerate itself. But we're overrunning the Earth as an organism. So around 1900, we were somewhere around using 3% of the Earth's capacity to regenerate itself. By 1970, we shot through that to 100%. And today we're running, we need 1.8 Earths to exist. Or in New Zealand, it's actually, with our lifestyle, 3.3 Earths we need. So we're really at this stage where we've become, we're exceeding the Earth's capacity to regenerate itself, and we've become a parasite, eating the host, destroying the host. So this is a crucial time in human history where we need to act. And while climate change is one thing we need to act on, there's actually a lot more than that, because we have this measure of human progress as GDP, and it's not the right measure. It's actually needs to be a measure of our whole well-being and the well-being of the Earth. So we can ask, how did we get to this situation? Because a few hundred years back, our ancestors, if you're of European origin, our ancestors, and if you don't have nobility in your ancestry, you would have been living close to the land, and with a low material well-being. And then suddenly from Europe, there was this expansion outwards and a plunge into the world of materialism, and a conquering of the physical world, which was then, if you of from an indigenous people, you would have experienced as a crushing, a colonization, a destruction of your culture. So to look at what's behind it, what happened, why did starting from Europe but then spreading across the world, because all the peoples of the world went through something similar, something changed. We were living close to nature, we were in tune with nature. You might say, in one sense, organic farmers, we were organic in those times, but it was much more intuitive. The knowledge of farming was passed down as rhyme, from your parents or your grandparents. You got rhymes like red sky at night, shepherd's delight, red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning. That's how agricultural knowledge was passed down, and that disappeared, and is almost entirely gone from even our language. We don't have very much of it left, and it was replaced. And living in nature, you would have noticed the changes in plants and animals in their activity. You would be close to the seasons. and now we're quite divorced from it. There had to be something that happened. And so I'd just like to talk to that a bit, because I see that as, for me, as the crucial change in human history. And if I could ask Lou or Pete to slow up, to throw up the first slide. And so you can't always see this directly, but then you may see a change that happened, a change in human consciousness that's reflected in art, and you can follow it through. So on the left is a painting from the 12th century, and on the right is a painting from the 15th century. Both portraits, but there's also some quite big changes that take place across that time. So on the painting from the 12th century on the left, the representation of the human body is just not quite right. The fingers are very elongated. The faces don't have quite the look. There's a slight distortion, you might say. It's also there's no perspective in it. It's almost just two-dimensional, and yet there's such beauty in it as well. And then on the right, the painting from the 15th century, there's quite a change that happened there, and that there's perspective in it, there's depth that appears in the photo, in the painting, and the human features become more as you look at another person. That's what you see. That's very close to them. So somewhere between the 12th and the 15th century, something happened in human consciousness, because the painter on the left is painting in quite a different way to the painter on the right. And if you think about it a bit more closely and look at it, the painter from the 12th century was as if they were totally immersed in it. They couldn't separate themselves out. They were part of what they, part of the whole being of everything. Whereas the painter on the right in the 15th century is able to separate themselves out and get perspective into the painting. So they're looking at things in quite a different way. And you can find this expressed in lots of different ways, but what actually happened between the 12th and actually from the 15th, but from the 15th century on, a big change, and that self-consciousness came about to human beings. We were able to, in the 12th century, we were immersed in everything. We couldn't separate ourselves out. But somewhere in the 15th century, we gained this self-consciousness that we could stand apart from everything. There's me, and I feel myself apart from the world. And it's also reflected in language. So the word self has deep roots in history, but it only meant, it was only taken as a dative, as a noun. So it was always expressed something like, oh, he's his cheery self today, referring to another person. But from the 15th century on, and actually into the dictionary, but somewhere into the English dictionary, somewhere around the end of the 15th and beginning of 16th century, the word self took on another meaning. It meant somebody the same person referring to themselves. So actually that concept of being able to refer to yourself, the word self, myself, was actually not a concept that existed prior to the 15th century. We can see it in painting, we can see it in language. It's very hard to understand that development from our perspective now, because it's quite natural for us that we think of ourselves, our consciousness. Why was it ever different? And yet we can see something that happened here, and it reflected in art. And then we can also see that you could say the painter from the 12th century was subjective. They were involved, totally immersed in it. But in the 15th century, it became objective. And this objective way of thinking is that came about, then gave rise to science. So science only followed this change in our consciousness. We didn't have science as we know it prior to the 15th century. And it's actually only really in the 16th century that science started emerging through people like Francis Bacon, through a lot of personalities across Europe began to appear, and the scientific method, or our way of looking at things, came about. But it was a physical science, in the sense that everything had to be verified by the senses. So if you couldn't physically verify it with sight or with your eyes, with your ears, with your touch, whatever, if you couldn't physically verify it, then it was not considered science. So anything beyond the physical realm was started to be ruled out as unscientific. So whereas lots of things exist that you could say on that basis are unscientific, and yet are part of our life. If you move on, Pete, if you could show the next slide. I just want to show sort of a progression of painting. So by the 18th century, the painting on the left is almost like a photograph. Our penetration of, if you like, perspective of standing, of objectively looking at something had advanced so far that we're actually able to capture the fine details of everything, and really get a strong perspective of everything. But then again, something different happened from the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and that we crossed one of the 5 thresholds that are around us that we can't cross directly with our day consciousness. And this is the time of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and Oscar Wilde writing A Picture of Dorian Gray. We started to go inward, trying to uncover inwardly who we are. We crossed that inner threshold into ourselves, and it's reflected in our painting. So I just wanted to bring that perspective to you, because I think that's really important to see this change of human consciousness. So somewhere from the 15th century, and then with the advent of science, we gained a different perspective on the world, and we came emanating from Europe, but then spreading to other peoples across the world, came this drive of conquering the physical world, and the rise of materialism. And at the same time, you can see the drive in economy. Economy in the word economy in itself means the exchange of goods and services between people. But we can see over this period of time, economy has evolved from being mercantile economy to being financial economy. And now we're not concerned so much about the exchange of goods and services between people as to what the financial outcome is. It's become all about money. So we've come to this juncture in history, which or in human evolution, where we all live, where we all stand now, and we start to have these choices that we need to be made, and it's coming to this perspective of what's happening in the world. And it's the science and economics we have. So when we look at from an agricultural point of view, if you look at the evolution of agriculture, it's been since the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, but really accelerating in the 20th century, is this idea of how can we extract more from the land at a lesser cost. And Philippa Jamieson is talking after me this afternoon on GE. And you can see this technology of GE is just an extension of this thinking of how can we extract more from the earth at a lesser cost. This is just an extension of the way we've been going, the way of human evolution, which is actually totally destructive upon the earth. We're destroying the earth as we go, with little regard for it. And somewhere we're looking towards technology for more answers, when that's not where the answers are to be found. I think we look back on people who thought in the past that the earth was flat. We look back at them and laugh and think, oh, they're a bit silly. I think in a few centuries' time, people were going to look back on us and say, those people thought they could control nature. Actually, they're really feeble-minded. They're actually really haven't got a grasp on reality. It's not possible to control nature. It's not possible to use technology in any way to control nature. And so the whole path that agriculture is on is actually against reality, against the being of the earth. And so I see biodynamics and organics is actually the beginning of the realization of our relationship to the earth needing to change. And this is the start of the path of saying, actually, no, rather than working against or trying to control nature, we're trying to work in harmony with nature. We're starting to begin to understand what's there in nature. And so while while most of the world is rushing to AI, we need to be rushing in the other direction towards NI, or the intelligence that nature holds, and recognizing that intelligence, and beginning to adjust our lifestyles to come in harmony with it. And so it's this pathway that organics is on is very important for the world. We're not the only ones, of course. There's people that are interested in rewilding the earth. Well, that's also an important movement. But no, all of us have to start looking at the earth, at the environment in a different way. We need to start simply, because we can't do everything at once. We need to look at those aspects we can easily change. A bit like people often ask me, well, where should I start with organics, with a diet? I just say, well, start simply, change the main grain you use. Try and start using seasonable vegetables. Don't try and change everything at once. It often doesn't work in the long run. It's better to incorporate things and make them a habit, a few at a time. There's, from the perspective we're in, there's actually very few perfect answers in what we do. So everything is a compromise. There's not many perfect answers to packaging, to food packaging. Electric vehicles are a compromise. We're actually using a lot of the Earth's resources, extracting the materials to make an electric car. But if we can hang on and use those, any vehicle or anything from technology longer to stretch its life, so we don't draw upon more of the Earth's surface resources, that's a good step. So things take time. It will take time, but we've got to consciously work at it. And I think one of the important things is to begin to observe what's happening in your garden, in nature around you, not with any preconditions. Don't go out, don't go thinking, well, I know this happens. Just go and observe and think about what you've observed. With just take that in, because nature can surprise if you live into it. There's a lot of surprises there, and you'll begin to see that actually it may not be quite as what you thought. Yeah, so yeah, I just encourage everybody to look at their relationship to the earth, because I think it's really important now that we need to change, because the earth is dying as expressed in climate change. It's dying, and we need to change. And so, yeah, for the sake of ourselves and for the sake of the earth. So thank you. Thank you all for coming, listening today.
Kia ora, Noel. That was beautiful food for thought, and I loved your imagery, and that's a fantastic parallel for the work that we're doing in food production and supporting the soil health, to compare that to that evolution of art. That was yeah, gave me shivers. So that was amazing. Thank you very much. Now, Lou, what are we doing next on our Organicathon?
I was going to ask, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask Noel with regards to his talk? Feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to pop off mute, you can. Noel, I had a question for you, if you don't mind, and it's I just want to ask, are you still hopeful for the future of humanity?
Oh, absolutely. I just think people come. I think it takes. Unfortunately, I think it takes a disaster to change people, but people change very quickly when they see. They need to change. Change comes very quickly then. But yeah, so I'm absolutely hopeful for the future.
And what keeps you hopeful? Because I know we live in this time where lots of people are feeling anxiety around the current state of affairs with the climate. What keeps you hopeful? What words of advice have you got for those that are feeling a bit desperate?
I think well, I could express it in some in a lot of ways, but there's a verse that comes to mind from Rudolf Steiner, which is about trust in the presence of the spiritual world to assist us when we make the right choices. That's not quite the verse. I can't remember the wording exactly offhand. But I'm the other thing that makes me very hopeful is all the change that I'm seeing around. Yeah, all the things that are moving. Of course, you always think things should be going faster than what they're going, but they are happening and change is coming.
Katrina's got a hand up. Katrina, do you want to ask Noel your question?
It's yeah, I'd love to. It's probably 3 questions in one. I have a habit of compressing things. Noel, you've been in the organic sector for so many years, and I can imagine back in the 80s, I've seen on the Ceres website, you said you were all seen as crazy people back then.
Yes.
Like,
well,
pushing the envelope of what people thought was possible. And I just kind of want to speak about how with my work now, teaching biodynamic composting and bringing nature communication into that and giving a voice to landscapes, to trees, to plants, to the soil, that I often feel that same "you're crazy" coming from the business community, from local body politicians, from larger sort of higher up politicians, one of whom recently said to me, "Katrina, there is no money for sustainability and environmental work. We're going into an economic recession. The world will wait. Go get a job." And I've been sort of pondering the term public servant and how our politicians need to serve the community. And I'm just wondering your perspective as a leader in the organic business space. What would you like to see consumers and members of the public do to put pressure on our public servants to prioritize the health of the planet? Because you've been carrying that torch for many decades.
Well, there's a number of things I'd say. Firstly, I don't think change comes from politicians. So for me, politicians always represent where the majority of people stand. Or you could say change always comes from the periphery. It never comes from the center. So no matter what dimension you take, it's change always comes, comes from small beginnings. So I think politicians or government or other have the ability to amplify that and move it quickly, but it takes it always begins with a small group of people. Any change begins with a small group of people, and they just have to work and think their way and act, especially in ways that start to really make sense. The second thing I'd say is I don't believe in financial crises as something in themselves, and that I think money is not something in itself. It's only a reflection of what's going on. So money reflects the activity that's out there, and to say there's a financial crisis is rubbish. It means there's something wrong in the social body that needs correcting, not something wrong in the money and there's no money. It's actually to look to look at the social being of a community, what's wrong, that's then reflected as a financial crisis. So that sort of partly answers what you're saying, but yeah, just know it can be a lonely path at the start, but that there's always people around you, and they're the people that you really need to gain support. It's hard to it's hard to leap over those people and go towards government agencies. Rather, that body round you needs to grow and be substantial.
Thank you.
Sol, do you want to ask your question? Or do you want to comment on what both Noel and Katrina are talking about?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I totally. I love what you're saying, Noel. Yeah, how to affect change, and obviously it starts with us, and I think people who are here now are, obviously awake to a bigger or lesser degree. How do we, it's an election year too. Not that I'm particularly into politics, but it does dictate a lot. And how do we shift? How do we get them to acknowledge kind of what you're talking about? Because I utterly agree. I think that GDP is bollocks, really, and yeah. So how do we do that? And I somehow feel like there's something about doing it as a collective. Well, can the organic movement do something about that? And in Denmark a long time ago, they had quite a shift in their political scheme, and somehow there was a collective will to go toward organics, and that was, we were actually ahead at the time. We had an iPhone conference in Christchurch before they'd got on board, and yet they have adopted it, and they're world leaders in the organic way, really, and have now leveled the playing field with things like pesticide tax, which, it's a function, but what it does is it sends a clear message that this isn't, we need to acknowledge the environment and what we do. I'll stop there and let you answer from whatever you feel. Yeah.
I think the government will take notice of a community that's very strong and united, and I think the organic movement right now is on the right path. It's quite united. Everybody's working together at this stage. I mean, there's always a few people that dissent, but that happens in everything. But it's actually quite united, and I think a lot of our attention needs to be paid to keeping it united. It's been inclusive. It's with you could say the organic movement is it included small farmers. It's included Te Waka Kaiora. It's an inclusive organization. I think as long as you might say the larger or more powerful bodies don't try and just surge on themselves, that's it's important that, like, all farmers are involved. The importance of a big farmer that's export orientated is in one sense no greater than the small home gardener. they have an important role to, a small home gardener has an important role to play in a community, and it's this community development. If we can keep united and keep moving forward as a community, I think we'll be strong. And I think the government will take more and more notice of us, because the answers that we have address a lot of the problems society is facing.
Thank you. I also loved what you said about climate change. It's not just the issue. Thank you. That was great, because I just feel it's not a distraction, that's the wrong word, but it's, man, if it was everything, if it was tackling soil, if it was tackling pollution, it was, yeah, anyway, I like that too.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any more questions? We've got Alison in the chat saying, I believe there's a potentially strong role that our politicians can play. Alison, do you have anything more to say, or do you want to, what can our politicians be doing, and why aren't they doing anything now? What are they doing? How can we get them more engaged?
And for several years that there is a provision already in the law to apply a pollution tax, but this has never been carried out. The provision legally is there, but it has not been enacted by politicians for, you can imagine, a whole variety of reasons. And if we get a change of government, it definitely would not be enacted. So there is an important role for government. Government can, I mean, Sol has already pointed out to the example of Denmark, but there are other countries. I'm trying to remember the Indian state, was it Sikkim? Sikkim, that's right, which became organic, and Sri Lanka tried to do it, but it wasn't successful. And the reason, from what I read, that Sikkim was successful was that because they had a person at the top in politics overseeing and agreeing to a number of different measures, and really important among that were local hubs to educate farmers. And this was raised as an issue on Thursday, on our Thursday Zoom seminar, to have local hubs to educate farmers, to educate growers about another way they can deal with problems or issues that arise. And but it does need guidance from the top. If you have a government that where it isn't a priority, nothing much will be done. Now, some years ago, I attended an OECD gathering in Wellington, and one of the things they discussed was a pesticide reduction program. And New Zealand was almost shamed at that gathering because of the fact that it had not instituted a pesticide reduction program, unlike many other countries, especially in Europe. And there is this push, extra push that we can apply from the perspective of climate change, where if we don't reduce pesticides and fertilizers, it's going to increase the use, keep on increasing the use of fossil fuel and all that entails from the perspective of climate change. And so I think it's really important to have a strong voice in government, not only backing the organic sector and dealing with a single body. And I believe that that's the strength of OANZ, to unite the organic bodies together to present as a united force to government. I think that's so important. And this is especially important in the wake of climate change. I mean, the science is there, that organic agriculture reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And there are so many other reasons apart from the less pollution and so on. So I think it's really important that we approach our local politician, get to know your local MP, and talk about bringing in a pesticide tax, a pollution tax. Talk about bringing in subsidies for these local environmental hubs to educate growers and farmers dealing with problems that may arise, but not from, I mean, one of the problems with our society at the moment is that it's, I really admire the perspective that Noel drew, that historical perspective on how things have been geared towards finances, towards making money. And this is a real weakness of the system that we have now. And so I think it's really important to steer everything away from that weakening factor in our society towards something that is more holistic, that is more towards the well-being of not only ourselves and the planet. So I'll just put a little plug in for my talk at 2:45, where I deal with New Zealand's Dirty Dozen, so food available in New Zealand that's more likely to have pesticide residues. Yeah.
Thanks, Alison. There's been a lot of interest in your talk, actually. We don't have a lot of knowledge I don't feel like we have a lot of available knowledge in New Zealand around the Dirty Dozen. It all comes from the American perspective, so it'll be really interesting to see your perspective on this. Sol, you also mentioned then who then will stand as an MP to represent organics? Who's going to put their hands up? Nobody here?
I know we had Stefan. I'm not sure if that's Stefan here now, but I know we had Stefan in there, mate. You were great.
Need more.
Of course, there was Rod Donald was way back in the days, was most certainly one of our trailblazers. Yeah.
We have politicians that will support organics if we can show them how through organics they can reach the objectives the government already has. That to me is the easiest pathway.
Absolutely. And what do we need to do that? More data, more research, right?
Yes, more talking.
Yep. Does anybody
making us, becoming more visible.
Does anybody have any more questions before we close off this session?
Stefan here that Sol was talking of before. And I have to thank Sol very, very much for building an itinerary for me when I visited Denmark as a Member of Parliament. And unfortunately came back into election year, and party had other priorities than to espouse that. But in Parliament, in the Select Committee, Primary Production Select Committee, they heard the organics continually in there. I've just been to a recent OAN's brainstorming meeting, and the thought is, as Alison sort of said earlier, that we should be going to all MPs and politicians from all parties and pushing it. The National Party has several MPs with organic farms at the moment. The Greens, I'm hoping that Scott Willis and Dave Kennedy rise up the list enough. While they're not practitioners in the organic world, they got a good grasp of it and could be promoting it as such in there. But we need to go across all parties and get it. The problem is the regulators. I believe the people in some of the MPI, they've just done the organics bill, production and products and production bill, but really the regulators are under the influence of big business, whether it's the Ministry for the Environment, whether it's MPI and food safety, whether
Oh, we're losing you, Stefan. No, have we lost Stefan? Anybody else here? Okay, I think we might have lost him. I think we're going to have a little break between Philippa's session. So for everyone who's here now, we've got Philippa Jameson coming up next at 15 minutes past 12. Philippa's going to be talking about GE and GMO and doing some myth busting. So please stay online. I'm going to put everybody shortly into the waiting room.